Well, that's a cool scene. I am pretty sure that scene will never, ever be repeated in another Zelda game. Greetings, everybody. My name is Tommy the Game Master, and welcome to my review of Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. I know I'm in a minority, but one of the things I wanted to switch for was the classic library of NES and SNES games that they have on their online. While their most recent entries have been disappointing for sure, I mean, seriously? Hey punk, are you tough enough? I wouldn't be too surprised if physical copies from the 90s were still sitting at the bottom of some retailer's bargain bin. But let's not forget that each console started up with a really strong lineup of both NES and Super Nintendo classics, including the one I'm talking about here. If you have a Switch Online account and you haven't played the game I'm talking about, you are missing out on a treat, and you should download the app and start playing right away. Let's talk about my favorite Super Nintendo game, Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. The story in this game is basically where the bedrock of the lore starts from the Zelda series. Sure, Ocarina of Time may have fleshed it out quite a bit more and did the whole 3 timeline thing, and Skyward Sword helped tell the origins of the Master Sword, but the majority of the chunk of Zelda lore comes from this game. Basically, in Hyrule, there's a whole lost realm called the Sacred Realm that houses a powerful object known as the Triforce. The way to get into the Sacred Realm has been lost for ages, until a thief called Ganondorf found it and misused the Triforce to, you guessed it, take over the world. 7 wise men sealed him, and the Sacred Realm, now called the Dark Realm, has kind of been lost for the ages. The 7 mages didn't stop there. They also carved a special sword called the Master Sword, or the Swords of Evil's Bane. Unfortunately, no one could wield the sword, so instead they've just placed it in the pedestal in the middle of the woods. Skip a few centuries later, and a wizard named Akna Ikrum, we'll call him Fred, has taken over the kingdom and is making the descendants of the same sages disappear. Which is bad, because the local princess named Zelda, she seems to be related to one of them. Sending out a telepathic plea for help, a young boy named Link wakes up in time to see his uncle walking off with the family sword and shield, and Link follows him into a secret passageway that leads under Hyrule Castle. There, the uncle gets injured and asks Link to take the sword and shield and continue his mission to rescue Zelda, which he accomplishes and takes her to a church called Sanctuary. There, the local monk tells him to see the village elder, and after a few misadventures later, manages to find him and talk to him. Seems like there's a legend that a hero will arise from the last of the knights of Hyrule that helped the mages stop the great cataclysm from happening. Link is of course the chosen one and must find 3 pendants to prove he is worthy by entering 3 dungeons and beating them. Then he can claim the Master Sword, which should be able to kill Fred here. Now, I see what you're saying. This was done in Twilight Princess, Ocarina of Time, and Wind Waker. And I will say, yes it was. But it was done first here, and it's done really well. For example, look at the woods you have to go through, which while not as hard to traverse as, say, Twilight Princess, it still has this really murky atmospheric fog and smoke. And the music that plays while you're going through it, hunting for the Master Sword, is really mysterious. It's one of my favorite Zelda soundtracks, and while I do like Saria's song, to me, this is the real Lost Woods music. So yeah, it was the first and one of the best, and yes, if you're asking, does the feces hit the fan the moment that you get the Master Sword and pull it out of the pedestal? Right. After you pull it out, the wizard finds Zelda and kidnaps her again, and Link this time is too late to rescue her and gets pulled into the dark world by the wizard. There's a new quest appears before him to find the 7 sages and save them from their crystal prisons by, you guessed it, beating 7 dungeons in the dark world. And yes, it is a MacGuffin quest, but unlike other Zelda games, Each time you get one of the crystals, the girl who's sealed inside it will tell you more of the lore of this world and what's going on. And yes, the lore they tell is almost similar to the Ocarina of Time, which was originally supposed to be a direct prequel to this game, but things got changed and the whole timeline things got started. Still, to me, who hasn't played a Final Fantasy game yet when I first played this, or even a really story-based game, this was epic and I loved it to death as a kid, and still do. At any rate, the game ends with, of course, Link rescuing Zelda, storming Ganon's tower, and defeating and making bacon out of the boar, and claiming the Triforce at the end of the game. Is it the best video game story ever told? No. There's no character development, and there are a lot of plot holes, and I will admit to that. But it's still one of my favorite, and it's an enjoyable old school one that I do recommend playing. Oh, and one last thing. One of the things that drew me into this game as a middle schooler is just the artwork. Ever wonder why old farts like me talk about how we miss the instruction manuals of our youth? It's because of great hand-drawn artwork like this. The artwork in the instruction booklet of this game is beautiful. I will try to paste a link to it so you can take a look at it down below. Hey kids, did you like the open world that Breath of the Wild was? You did? How about those of you who like Zelda with complicated dungeons and puzzles to solve? Well, Link to the Past has best of both worlds here. Sure, the overworld is ridiculously tiny compared to nowadays, but when you put both the light and dark world together and just compare them to the games of its time, and you will see Zelda: A Link to the Past had a pretty huge overworld, at least compared to back in the day. And the best part, it is entirely open to explore, provided you have the right object, which for the light world basically means the flippers and the right gloves to lift the rocks. However, this game also has the dark world to explore. It's a mirror world, but unlike the light world, traversing it isn't quite as easy. Here you have to use your items a lot better and know when to work between both light and dark world in order to get to certain places in the dark world. And if you manage to find a flute that lets you fly around the light world traversing gets really easy. You see, in the light world, there are certain locations where there's portals that can lead you back into the dark world. Using them is a necessity if you want to find the dungeons and clear the game. Basically, getting around the overworld is fun, and Nintendo took a few inspirations from this old Zelda game to make Breath of the Wild's overworld. And the transition between the two worlds, both as a visual story element and as a gameplay element, works a lot better than Ocarina of Time. The dark world here has a lot more bad guys and monsters who are a lot stronger, and the world is just filled with ruin, and you can kind of see the misery about it. It's almost like Ganon purposely wrecked this world, then actually trying to improve it like he did in Ocarina of Time, because outside the drunken bender he had in the castle town, the rest of the traversing of the overworld in Ocarina of Time was actually easier. In this case, you see and feel what's at stake here and why Link's quest to save Hyrule is important, when you just see this really corrupted world, and the way they did it graphically at the time is good. And there are, of course, a few secrets and upgrades to find too, so the game does reward you quite well for exploring and listening to the villagers. But it's hard to get lost because it has one of the best maps for its day. Just pressing the X button brings this detailed map up, so you always have some idea of where to go. But what about the dungeons, you're saying? Well, they're not as big or complex as later Zelda games, but that doesn't mean there aren't some devious puzzles. I remember being stumped for about 2 days in the Palace of Darkness, and I was on Christmas break, so this was 2 days of non-stop playing. And this was before the internet, where I could just look it up online to figure out what I was doing wrong. It took me over 100 tries to get past this dungeon. That meant I died over 100 times. And it basically just had to do with a few simple things like a secret moving statue or where to find the secret switch. But needless to say, I felt really rewarded when I beat the boss and got my first crystal. Still, there are a lot of good puzzles in this game. So while the dungeons may be a bit on the short side, that doesn't mean they won't try to stump you the first time through. As for the items, there are very few that feel one and done, and it's mainly this brown cane here, but every other dungeon item you're going to be putting to good use in some form or another, whether it's the hook shot or the hammer or the fire rod. They're all good and fun to use. And I should also talk about the sword upgrades. Yeah, a lot of Zelda games let you get the Master Sword, and it does feel a bit more powerful. But in the Link to the Past, you feel like you're a badass once you get the sword. You can fire beams, and a lot of the castle soldiers go down in a lot less time. But the more you upgrade, the more powerful it becomes. And when you get it to the golden level 4, you feel like most enemies can be cut through like a hot knife through butter. But until you earn a few upgrades, you can easily die if you're not careful. A few enemy hits in the beginning can lead to a game over screen. And while fairies can revive you, they only leave you with a small handful of hearts. Overall, the game is perfectly balanced. The only complaint I have, and the part that hasn't aged well, is the overworld is a bit small to today's standards. Don't get me wrong on that. It's still complex and very fun to explore for a 16-bit game. But if you compare that to the Breath of the Wild, and it feels like you're playing just a miniature version of Zelda here. Still, one of my favorites, and its direct sequel for the 3DS, A Link Between Worlds, is also definitely worth checking out if you still have a 3DS. The graphics in A Link to the Past have aged okay. Not great, but okay. For example, Link's hair here is an odd shade of pink, but compared to the NES version, the overworld feels alive. There are tons of cemeteries, swamps, deserts, and even a lake to explore, and they all feel different and feel like they're still connected throughout this game, and just the looks being cartoony make it really fun to explore. Where the game I feel falls apart, though, are some very similar looking details, like the trees all being identical, for example, and extremely generic looking side characters. Doesn't mean this game lacks charm. I don't think so, but I played this with my nostalgic goggles on, and still think it's one of the best looking games for its time, and a great expansion to the Zelda universe coming from the first two games. This game has one of my favorite soundtracks of the 16-bit era. I've already talked about my favorite, The Lost Wood tracks, but the overworld theme and the way it's been remixed for the Super Nintendo is just one of my favorite songs from my childhood, and I still just have it randomly pop up on my head, and it's just my favorite rendition of that tune. You just can't top it to me. Other tunes like Death Mountain or the Dark World tune is pretty memorable, and it fits the themes that are shown as Link steps into this world of ruin and the monsters get a lot tougher. I would say the audio is the best ever on the Super Nintendo, next to maybe games like Chrono Trigger. If it wasn't for one itty bitty small thing that has been a butt of a lot of dorkly videos. And that one small thing is, don't run low on health for more than a few minutes in this game if you value your sanity. God, tells me if this is annoying or not. Yeah, I know it's supposed to alert me I'm low on health and try to find hearts, but oftentimes it makes me want to die quicker just to make the damn thing shut up. God, it's annoying. One of the worst sounds in video games next to Baby Mario crying. But at least with him I could make it stop just by catching him again. This goes on and on until you either die or get a heart refill. It's really annoying. It's really only the bad thing I have to say when it comes to the sound or this game in general is just the game aggravates you with a loud annoying beep 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 sound when you're low on health, and considering how that's the worst thing I can say about this game, shows you how pretty epic this game is. Do I recommend trying this game out? Since a lot of Nintendo fans own Switches, and probably pay for the online service, you can play this game for free. And a lot of other old school gamers who may not have run out to get Switches right away, but may have decided to pick up an SNES Mini, which this game is included, and are asking if this game is worth getting into if you didn't play it back in the game, I would say absolutely 100% heck yes. If you own any Nintendo console where this game is available, and it's pretty much on all the consoles released the last 2 decades, you deserve to pick this game up and play it. It's one of the best games ever made. And unlike some of the other Super Nintendo games like Super Metroid, this one is easy enough to play with just the Joy-Cons on the Switch, so you have no excuse to not go out and pick this one up.